Okay, welcome everybody to Leeds Theosophical Society for the latest of our Zoom conversations. We've been running these Zoom things now for about 5.5 years, and we've done, I think, I've lost track, but I think we've done more than 100 of them. Anyway, this afternoon we're delighted to welcome one of our regular participants, Dr. Edi Bilimoria. And in recent times, Eddie and I have been doing quite a lot of work together. Eddie has produced this fantastic book. Well, it's more than one book. It's actually in 4 volumes called Unfolding Consciousness, which runs to more than 750,000 words. And he asked me some time back if we could do some condensed versions of these, which we did. And I managed to cut 770,000 words down to about 77,000 words, so reducing it by 90%. And this is going to be published sometime next spring, called Consciousness Came First. But Eddie and I are also involved in something which is pertinent to the topic that we're talking about this afternoon, which is the nature of genius. And Eddie and I are currently working on a film about one of the world's greatest geniuses, and certainly one of the greatest ones ever to emerge from England, Sir Isaac Newton. And we'll hopefully be shooting this film early next year. And we're taking a rather novel approach to this. And this is really what's prompted this afternoon's conversation, because Eddie deals a lot with it in his books. Where does genius actually come from? How is it that Mozart starts writing music when he's 3 or 4 years old, and he's writing symphonies by the age of 7? He didn't come from a particularly musical family, but he was able to do these things. And when we look at the lives of other geniuses throughout history, which we'll be exploring later, we'll see that often they come from very modest backgrounds, and yet they're able to excel. And it's almost as if there are some people, and I suspect that Eddie believes this, and I certainly believe this, who clearly display a knowledge which they wouldn't be entitled to in this life because they simply haven't had that experience. So where does genius come from? Where does prior knowledge come from? I think it was Plato who said that all knowledge is but remembering, suggesting that we bring these things through from other lives. So, Eddie, what's your view about all this? Where does this genius originate? Because clearly it's not down to any heredity or anything like that. It seems to be something that people bring with them in some ways. How would you explain it?
Well, Tim, genius manifests in all sorts of fields, not just music, not just science, but also in journalism. It takes somewhat of a genius to reduce 750,000 words into something that's manageable. So I think it's very important to realize that we all have a talent which, if we develop it and nurture it, it can, so to speak, boil over or sublimate into genius. And everyone has that unique capability. But now, when you ask where does it come from, I think the etymology of the word is significant. It's that genie in a bottle of Arabian folklore, the Arabian Nights. And that genie in a bottle is longing to be released, or sometimes in a lamp, genie in a lamp, which means that we're all, so to speak, geniuses, and we just want that to be released from the confinement it finds itself in. So it comes from that spirit. It comes from, in rather more technical terms, the higher self.
Mm, mm,
But there is a very important point to make, that even though every genius is completely unique, there are definitely common characteristics. So there is the cause of genius and there's the expression of genius. And it's the analogy of the seed and the soil. You can have very fertile soil, but if the seed is barren, nothing is going to grow. And you can have a wonderful seed uh, planted in fertile soil, in which case you have the expression of genius.
And of course, they do say that the cliche is that genius is 99% perspiration and
Oh, yes.
1% inspiration. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
Oh, I'd say 99.9% perspiration. Yes,
So people, all of us then have these innate abilities, and yet they're more developed in some people than others.
certainly.
It seems to me that, our educational system and many other things about modern culture militate against growing that seed and allowing that genius to come out because we have a kind of one size fits all education system, which is not tailored to individual needs. Is it possible to draw more talent out of more people if the circumstances are more likely to
More
produce that?
propitious.
Hmm.
Most certainly, because education, it means educare, to draw out, whereas a lot of education is stuffing in. So with education, I really feel that we should provide the minimum boundaries. Obviously, there have to be boundaries, but not to confine um, children, students, along a tram line, because the emphasis is on career, job, and money. Whereas if the value system were really doing what you love to do, if one could give students, children in school, the environment where they could do what they love doing rather than what they have to do to pass an exam, then that would allow that innate quality to flower into whatever it needs to. But that's, of course, easier said than done because the demands of life growing up and mortgage and family are so pressing that one feels obliged to go along the conventional tram lines. But that's
Well,
not at all conducive to the flowering of innate qualities. And the really brave people have broken away from those confines and paid the price of it and shown us the value of doing that.
Well, many geniuses, as you say, Eddie, have paid an enormous price. I mean, particularly when you look at the lives of some of the great composers, some of whom are behind you on the wall there. And when you think of Beethoven, I know he's one of your favorites. I mean, he had a terrible time, didn't he? Particularly during his later years.
Oh, he had a terrible time in his childhood. His father was extremely domineering, virtually an alcoholic. And it's just amazing that Beethoven took to music, given the way he was treated. And this really comes to a central point that one's family hereditary and background seems to have very little influence. I think only a very higher perspective on all of this would see the family influences and the background. You can think of, for example, Francis Bacon, who was certainly born into a very noble, I mean, we're told, the son of Queen Elizabeth I. He had a very aristocratic, intellectual, artistic lineage. But then Newton, born to a farming stock, a father who was completely illiterate, which doesn't mean he was unintelligent, but illiterate, and a mother who was barely literate. And you realize that your outward family circumstances seem to figure very little in all of this.
Does
Yeah,
this
and sometimes you find the seventh child. The seventh child is often the great genius.
Hmm.
in the
Well,
world of music.
the seventh child of
Yeah,
a seventh son of a seventh son, which has
yeah, that's right.
always
Yeah,
been something to have
yeah,
magical properties.
yeah. But
So
all
does
one
this
can
mean then,
say,
Eddie?
sorry?
Does this mean then, Eddie, that people who show this genius, these remarkable talents in whatever field, um, are they bringing this stuff over from other lives? And if they are, does that mean that these people are somehow more closely soul connected and therefore have a recollection of the things that they've experienced and learnt and the talents they've developed in previous lives? Is that a reasonable theory from an esoteric perspective?
It has to be the central theory, Tim. Um, what I feel is the individual details, of course, depend on the circumstances. I mean, you can't say a great pianist was practicing the piano millions of years ago. I mean, that's nonsensical because I mean the piano evolved from the clavichord and the harpsichord only a few centuries. But the sensitivity of the nervous system, the connection with the divine harmonies was certainly nurtured and developed in previous lives and brought through via the medium of expression in which the composer found himself born into.
And yet, the circumstances that many of these people are born into, I'm thinking of Leonardo and other people, they're not the most wonderful circumstances. Often,
Absolutely dreadful.
yeah, born to very, very impoverished parents, often ill-educated, and yet something shines through, doesn't it?
Yes, Leonardo, in fact, the vast majority, I mean, I'd be hard put to think of a genius who's really born to aristocratic and in gracious and comfortable surroundings. It just doesn't seem to figure. I
Hmm.
mean, Mozart, yes. I mean, his father was a court musician, and Mendelssohn was not born into poverty. But in general, their personal circumstances are very arduous and very difficult, which almost seems to provide the spur for them to break through that boundary.
Perhaps one of the greatest examples of this, and this is someone I know you're very interested in, is Srinivasa Ramanujan, the
Oh,
Indian
God.
mathematician. And he came from very poor background, and yet somehow he was able to come up with all these mathematical equations and ideas. Can you just talk a little bit about him? Because I think people will be very interested in how someone who'd had absolutely no connection with any of this was able to come up with stuff which people are still trying to drill
Right.
into years and years and years after his death. Hmm? Eddie seems to have
No, I just thought I'd bring the curtain down a bit.
oh, I see.
That's
Okay.
better. Yeah, well, Ramanujan is a prime example of someone who really received no formal mathematical education and landed up being a fellow of Trinity College and a fellow of the Royal Society. Um, as a young man in India, in near Chennai, actually, Madras, he failed some of his matriculation examinations because he was so interested in mathematics. And he only got a job as a clerk in the port trust, in the local government civil service, so to speak. But he wrote a letter to Godfrey Hardy, the prime mathematician at Trinity College. And when Hardy showed his letter to colleagues, they couldn't make head or tail of it. But it takes one, if not one genius, one great talent to recognize another. And Hardy realized that he was dealing with someone quite out of the ordinary. And so he invited Ramanujan to Cambridge. And then the story unfolds in a very dramatic and a very sad way, of course, being an absolutely pure vegetarian. The English climate hardly suited him. But despite all his illnesses and trials and tribulations, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society and a fellow of Trinity College. But the central point is that Ramanujan was the saying goes that Hardy was the apostle of proof and Ramanujan was the prophet of inspiration. So Ramanujan didn't need to prove. He sort of knew it. But any antagonism or friction between him and Hardy was Hardy wanted proof. I mean, you're saying all these things. How do you know about it? And as Ramanujan once said, well, if you want a proof, I'll find it. And that's exactly what Newton said to Halley when Halley challenged him about a certain planetary motion. He said, I've known it for years. If you want a proof, I'll find it, which he did, of course. But
Mm.
going back to Ramanujan, he did not have formal education in mathematics. In fact, none at all. So it just beggars belief when the materialists say, oh, well, it's just his neurons, or come up with some stupid argument like that. Where else did he get it from? Well, Ramanujan himself said from his goddess, I forget her name, the local goddess, he attributed his inspiration entirely to divinity. And his famous saying was, an equation has no meaning for me unless it expresses a thought of God,
Mm.
which is a highly profound saying, of course.
And of course, the film that we're working on at the moment is about a man, Sir Isaac Newton, who felt precisely the same way as that.
Exactly so, yes.
He felt that his inspiration was from the divine, that he was some sort of conduit from that, and that's where all this
Yes.
stuff came from. But when you're talking about Ramanujan, it also reminded me of Einstein, because Einstein had a fairly mundane position in the patent office when he
Yes.
first started doing his work on relativity, and he wasn't an outstanding academic scholar before that, was he?
No, not at all. He was working in the patent office in Zurich, but his inspiration was, I think, right from his earliest days, when mathematics and physics deeply inspired him, and also, in a very, very different way, a feeling for divinity in Einstein's case, in Newton's case, and very obviously in Ramanujan's case. However they express it, I think all geniuses in some way acknowledge the divine quite openly.
Well, that's
And
interesting because it means that they are then seeking something beyond themselves. None of them pretend that these are their own ideas in most
yeah,
cases, do they?
yeah,
They
yeah,
simply portray themselves as someone who is able to transmit that knowledge, to receive
yeah.
and then transmit it to other people. But they certainly don't come up usually with the idea, oh, it's all down to me.
Mm. Yes, absolutely right.
Mm.
So
Well,
the more one holds the idea or that it's not down to me, that means that the ego is held in abeyance. And the more the ego is held in abeyance, the less intrusion the personal self and the ego will make on what is flowing through one as a conduit.
mm. Well, I must say that as a writer, and I've heard other writers say this, when I'm writing, it's almost like the rest of the world just vanishes. And I don't know where my words come from. They're certainly, they're not manufactured in this 1,500 cubic centimeters of gray matter. They come from somewhere else, but I've no idea where. And so this obviously suggests that there is a greater repository of knowledge. Call it divinity if you want, but there is a greater pool of wisdom, knowledge, which we can all tap into if we choose to
Yes,
do this. Yes.
yes. And it has everything to do with inspiration. And the 99% of hard work is the concentration, the initial concentration that one has to put into whatever one is working on. But then that concentration sort of transforms or transmutes into a sort of mental quiescence, which is rather like the strings of the piano behind you being taut, but not sufficiently taut. If the strings were loose, you couldn't play a tune on it, or it would be a complete jangle. If they were too taut, they would snap. But the strings have got to be taut but quiet, so that then they can register the smallest quivering of the artist who is performing. So the process seems to be concentration, mental absorption, and then inspiration. And at that moment of inspiration, if the time is right, then there will be a flood of creativity and ideas. But then the other part of the 99% of labor is expressing it. It's one thing to acquire genius, it's another thing to express genius. And the expression of genius requires a technique. And this is why a lot of geniuses, their production, their output, can be clumsy and faulty because their expression in language or music or whatever is faulty. So if one has a great idea in science or any other subject, it has to be expressed through mathematics or experimentation.
Now,
So the two halves go together. Sorry, go on.
yeah. Well, when you used the word inspiration, it immediately got me thinking about what we talk about in theosophy. We talk about these three higher principles which make up our
Yeah.
immortal individuality: the higher mental faculty, the wisdom intuition faculty, and then obviously spirit itself. It's this wisdom intuition faculty which I believe is slowly unfolding to a greater degree amongst more people perhaps than it ever has before. And this obviously enables information to be conveyed to an individual which transcends the pure intellectual process. It's not filtered through the lower or higher mind. It comes in on a kind of an additional superhighway. And this is something that all people of talent and genius, I imagine, must be able to tap into, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And the greater the genius, the more you tap into it at will. I think a lot of them do tap into it, sometimes at the most awkward times. And don't we all sometimes find we have a good idea and we are struggling to find a scrap of paper to write it down on? But the greater genius can tap into it literally at will.
Yes, and we know from our studies of people like Newton that Newton was extremely well organized, but he was also very much a loner and spent long periods of time
Yeah.
by himself, just focusing on particular ideas, as indeed Einstein talks about his thought experiments, where he'd go into deep levels of concentration. So it's this concentration, I suppose, mixed with the inspiration, which and obviously the perspiration, which produces the final product.
Yes. Concentration, absorption, because the concentration must lead into you being absorbed with the subject. So all the geniuses have said in different ways that there's no separation between them and what they were focusing on. There is a union. So there's the great distinction between knowing through detachment, the conventional scientific way, knowing through detachment, and knowing through union and participation when you become that which you're researching. So you reach a stage when you're not researching the properties of light, but you become a beam of light, so to speak, within yourself. So wisdom through union rather than knowledge through detachment.
Because this way of thinking, this way of operating is so different from the way that most people would lead their lives. And it's probably why a lot of the people who've been dubbed a genius often appear very eccentric or even downright weird sometimes, because they are absorbed in their own thoughts, their own world, and they don't necessarily have much of an interface with the wider world and with mundane realities. And this, I suppose, separates them off, because a genius, to some extent, has to operate in isolation, doesn't he or she?
He certainly does, and there's no getting away from it. In much isolation, much quiet, and much time alone.
Yes, indeed, and also the ability to not be troubled by a lot of the events in the outside world. I mean, to
Yes.
what extent do you think people in modern science do this now? Are there still people who operate in this way, even in the, the highly materialistically minded world of science? Are there people, do you think, who operate in this particular way?
To the extent that such people are sincerely trying to push the boundaries of human understanding towards more compassion, more ecological sensitivity. To that extent, I think there are such people. One thinks of Ervin Laszlo, for example, who wrote the book Akasha, and there are others who are members of the Scientific Medical Network. Brian Josephson has had a very mixed reception from the physics community. Dare physicists talk about meditation, and the fact that he got a Nobel Prize doesn't figure. So, to the extent that such scientists, even now, are concerned with the wider viewpoint, I would say so. But there are others who are very concerned with maintaining status quo. Anil Seth, for example.
Yeah. And of course, science is very much dominated these days by two things in particular: money and reputation.
Yes.
And I suppose those things by themselves are going to inflate their egos, their lower self-centered aspects of themselves more than they might have done. I mean, to be dedicated to discovering pure knowledge, to go into new fields of activity, is different from, say, it was in Newton's day, because science was just, as we know it today, was just being born at that particular time. And scientists, I suppose, although they contacted one another, more of them tended to work in isolation, whereas science today is very much a team effort, isn't it? I mean, that's how you've worked, as part of huge teams on big projects.
Yes. It is a team effort. And the more the emphasis is on reputation and Nobel Prize, the less will be the creativity. I think one can almost formulate a mathematical equation to that effect.
Mm, mm, mm.
Because I remember Ravindra telling us in a podcast that at Princeton University, he was trying to interest a few students in attending a fortnight's meditational experience, a Zen meditational, and not one student was interested. And furthermore, students from different science departments were not talking to each other because the top professor was chasing the Nobel Prize. So, if you talk to another person's students, you might pinch his ideas. So the the more the Nobel Prize, the more the reputation figures, the less the creativity. Of course, you can go on the tram lines of what is existing and what is being developed at the moment, but it will not be a breakthrough. It will not be a breakthrough. And you find again with these great geniuses, their lives were miserable and poverty stricken. But one of the um, essential elements you find in all geniuses in their work is joy. And joy is not pleasure, of course. And the great Franz Liszt, who is behind me, when he was contemplating the portrait, the beautiful portrait of Saint Cecilia, Raphael's portrait, he was moved to write that God has planted, or God has concealed, not planted, concealed, very important word, concealed more joy in an artist's might than in all the gold of a millionaire. So a central quality of genius of any field is that quality of joy, whereby you're prepared to starve for your joy.
Yes, but of course as well, it's down to the fact that the not only the joy, but these individuals seem to be absolutely driven to do whatever they do. They seem to have some inner driving force, which they can't escape.
Yes.
It's almost as if they're consumed and
Mm,
inhabited by this
mm,
force, isn't it?
yes, it does seem that. And I think here there is nothing, really nothing, in my opinion, to touch the theosophical teaching on the evolution of the human race, particularly the activity of the Manasaputras, the Agnishvatas, and the Kumaras, where in the secret doctrine it's explained in very clear terms that some of these higher beings, so to speak, depending on the grade of material of the shadow human, the form, depending on that grade of material, they were either able to project a spark or infuse the whole of their being. And I suggest that the great genius has the majority of the essence of the Manasaputras.
These are, of course, the
Yeah,
sons of mind, which are
tons
referred
of
to
mind.
in the secret doctrine, and the other names, the Agnishvatas, are
Yeah,
just equivalent terms
the
for them. But these
different
are
aspects. Yes.
essentially off-planetary entities who
Mm,
come to try and instill the principle of mind in human beings. Yes.
yeah. I think there's no way one can possibly explain mind, let alone genius, without drawing on this higher wisdom.
Mm, mm. Just to go back to what you were saying about science, and we obviously talk a lot about science. You're a scientist, a dissident scientist, perhaps we might call you. But
Rebellious
so,
one.
yeah, it strikes me that science now is, so specialized, and you get specialisms within specialisms, and you get all these silos of different specialisms. But the problem is, there's very few people who can talk about the whole job. Oh no, that's not my area of study, etc. So there are not that many generalists about. Everybody becomes more and more specialist. And I
Mm.
suppose one of the results of that is the fact that people, even within, say, physics or biology, can't talk to each other because they are so focused on a particular strand of this that they don't, they'll see a particular branch, but they don't see the whole tree. And therefore, this strikes me as being something which is quite detrimental to the furtherance of our knowledge, because until we can see the big picture, we're just going down some little back alley
Yeah,
or little
yeah.
stream, aren't we?
Mm. One always starts with the bigger picture, the deductive approach. But what you're alluding to is the inductive. You start from the particular and then you try and build up a grand big picture. But in that is slightly breaking down, Tim, in a very small way, in various ways. For example, in engineering, now there is systems engineering. It's only on the physical plane, of course, but system engineering, by the very definition, means it's integrating various ideas as a system rather than looking at them as specialities. But within science itself, even in medicine, one doesn't see the equivalent of the good old-fashioned physician who would look at you as a complete human being first, and then uh, recommend a more specialist approach. But you're quite right. The specialist approach does not, or it militates against any real creativity. It's just more and more of the same.
I think, that we're moving into an age, if you want to call it the Aquarian age, we can do that. But we clearly are moving out of one cycle of existence into another one.
Another. Mm,
Will happen in the
mm,
coming decades. No one's quite sure of the timetable of all this.
mm,
And I suspect that one of the hallmarks of this new age will be a more synthesizing approach to these things, because it's said that the next age, the Aquarian age, is ruled mainly by the seventh ray, which is one
mm,
of ceremonial order and magic, and it is a synthesizing ray rather than the Piscean age from which we're emerging, which was principally governed by the sixth ray, which is devotion. And we've seen devotion so much in politics and religion and
mm.
so on. So I suspect that there is a new kind of consciousness emerging. And I think at the heart of it is something I said earlier on, this development of the wisdom intuition principle in people. But that's very difficult because people tend to rely so much on their intellects. They can almost become trapped by the intellect and not allow anything greater to come into them. But I suspect that that's going to change in the coming decades as we start to develop new groups of humanity. This so-called sixth subrace of our current fifth root race,
Yes,
the
the root
development
race.
groups.
Mm.
And I think this wisdom intuition principle is eventually going to become standard issue in human beings alongside our existing five physical senses. Is that your view?
Well, nothing can emerge, which is a real breakthrough, without a prior struggle and the need for it to do so. So, looking at the present age very optimistically, I do everything in life to simplify my life. Then things seem to getting more and more complicated, from passwords and two-factor authentication and all the other things that complicate your life. Now, how can wisdom emerge unless we realize as a species, as I forget, was it Eliot who said, "Where is the wisdom that is drowned in knowledge? Where is the knowledge that's drowned in data?" So when the pressure of all the things that complicate our lives, and when we realize that all this intellectual huffing and puffing is not getting us very far, it would, I would hope, create a hole, a large rent in the veil of intellect to let the wisdom principle shine through. So I
Yes.
really do think everything has its wider, higher purpose. And
Hmm.
why is it happening now? For that, presumably, for the higher purpose.
Well, I agree with you. I recently wrote an article for my Substack
Mm,
platform called The Complexity Conundrum. And it's
yeah,
it's
you did.
basically about how we're all drowning in data because science collects so much data about everything these days. And it seems to think that huge oceans of data provide the answers to problems. I'm sure they do to some extent, but data is just one thing.
It's
And,
just
and
data. Mm,
it's almost as if data and information, digitrash, and all this, we're drowning in this stuff. And it
mm,
actually is acting as a kind of mental pollution, in my opinion. And this translates particularly badly when you see so many people engaged in, all the trivia of social media and putting stuff out all the time. Not to the extent that it actually governs people's lives. You walk through any public space, as you and I do, and 80% of people are just staring at
yeah.
that bit of plastic all the time. They're not doing anything, they're not talking to each other as a rule. They're just
Mm,
staring at this thing and wondering whether someone said something nice or horrible or indifferent about them
Yeah.
on X or one of the other many platforms. So this idea that we're over complicating our lives, I think, translates into something even worse. The other day, I was reading something, I think it was from the World Health Organization, and it said that during their lives, 4 billion people, i.e., 50% of the world's population, are going to suffer some kind of mental health issue. Well, I mean, that's astonishing.
Right.
And, you just wonder, well, is that true for a start off? But if it is true, I mean, it's quite clear that so many people these days, particularly younger people, are suffering from anxiety, depression, and all the things which flow from that. And you wonder what the source of this might be. And is one of the reasons that we live in this overcomplicated world where, as you say, you can't do anything without a QR code or a password or
Yeah. Yeah.
second level authentication and everything. Is this complexity? I think it's driving people mad. I really do.
It is, Tim. Uh, I'm no prophet, but I can claim very confidently to have said, oh, even 20 years ago, that in my view, there's going to be a huge increase in mental health problems
Mm,
because the rate of technology progress is completely outstripping our ability to handle it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
science used wisely will certainly and has resulted in the physical liberation of man, but science used unwisely, increasingly now, will cause his downfall. And we see it all the time. We don't need the latest QR code, the latest text message, everything to distract you. And the more you're distracted, the further you are displaced from any path of creativity and genius. But just coming back to genius, Tim, when talk of science in the universities, everyone's trying to emulate someone they regard as a great person or a figurehead. And the great Japanese, I think Matsuo Basho, he put it so beautifully: do not follow in the footsteps of the masters. Seek what they sought. Because if you follow in their footsteps, it's more of the same. You're trying to go up their ladder. You can't. But if you seek what they sought, then you construct your own ladder and you can go up your own ladder to that high source. But just by imitating them or following in their footsteps, you will not find what they sought.
and of course this brings in another quality which people require here. I mean, as well as all the persistence and the perspiration involved, people also have to have courage, and most geniuses display a degree of courage because they are breaking new ground. They're going down pathways that people have not gone down before. They're expressing views which may be in direct contradiction to the religious or scientific beliefs of the time. And if they do, we know in the modern world, you've only got to breathe wrongly and you get cancelled these days. So
Yeah, yeah.
it does demand a degree of courage to be able to swim against the tide and to come up with ideas, just the way that.
Courage and great self-confidence, of course,
Hmm, hmm.
which from where that courage comes from, knowing that
When,
you're doing the right thing. Mm.
yeah, I mean, when you look at someone like Stephen Hawking, I mean, for much of his life, he was profoundly disabled. And
Yes,
even when he was just had one nerve operating so he could communicate with the outside world, he was still breaking new ground,
yeah.
even with
Well,
that limited capacity, wasn't he?
yes, and that's a great inspiration to show how even a broken, damaged body can still fulfill the purpose of a very strong driving spirit, even though he wouldn't ever agree with the language we're using.
Hmm. Probably not. But it just shows the persistence of the man, and
It does.
again reinforces this idea that geniuses are
Yeah.
somehow driven by this inner force to do whatever it is they have
Oh,
to do. It's
and it
almost
shows
like,
the power of consciousness. It shows the power of consciousness.
Yes, which, of course, as you say in your wonderful book, science has yet to satisfactorily define, other than an epiphenomenon of neural activity and chemical activity in the brain. Perhaps we could just spend the last couple of minutes of this talk exploring that, because your assertion is that, and the esoteric assertion is that consciousness did indeed come first, and it's consciousness that produces form, not, as science insists, that form which produces consciousness. Perhaps you'd just like to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, let's bring in the great Blavatsky. One of my favorite quotations from her is that the higher self is the musical instrument, is the performer, and the lower self is the instrument. And she says quite clearly, no activity of the greatest performer can produce a melody from a broken or cracked instrument. But that transmission of the fidelity from the higher self to the instrument is everything to do with karma. So the higher self is Paganini, who is always supreme. But whether you give Paganini a cheap or cracked fiddle or a Stradivarius entirely depends on your own self effort and karma. So it is very important to applaud science insofar as science tells us more about the fiddle, the violin. So the more science can help us to make a cheap and cracked fiddle into a Stradivarius, the more Paganini can play more beautifully on it. So neurological research and all of that is all very well, as long as we admit there is a Paganini who's going to play on that instrument. But of course, the vast majority of scientists would say that if you don't need a performer, then as Heifetz once, it's a great story when Heifetz was in Tel Aviv and the taxi driver said, Mr. Heifetz, your violin produces such lovely sounds. And the story is he opened his violin case and tapped the violin and said, lovely sounds? I don't hear them. What about me, the performer? So the whole emphasis is on the vehicle, the form. And with our understanding, we need to perfect the form in all lives so that our Paganini can play more beautifully when we next incarnate.
Well, I think on that musical note, Eddie, we'll wind up the conversation. Thank you so much for your insights and inspiration in all that. I mean, it's always wonderful to talk to you. And in the meantime, have a great week, everybody, and take care. And we hope to see you again
Thank you, Tim.
very soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you
Yeah.
both
Bye-bye,
so
everybody.
much.